you for putting NHS into an international perspective for us and really seeing some of the machinations that I think many people are simply not aware of and how that relates to TTIP. So lastly, we have Linda Kaucher speaking.
Kaucher.
Sorry?
Kaucher.
Kaucher, okay. Who has been researching free trade agreements for about, I think, 20 years, something, isn't it?
No, not that long.
Oh, no, not that long.
About 15.
15, right. And who founded the Stop TTIP group. And she's going to, I think, speak on a broad base about TTIP.
Okay, about TiSA actually. I'll talk about, yeah. Okay. I'm going to talk mostly about another agreement called TiSA, Trade in Services Agreement. Just to get you double worried. So the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that's been discussed here, is a bilateral trade agreement, two sides, right? US and EU. And the EU shifted from its WTO focus, World Trade Organization focus, which at the time was the Doha round, in 2005, shifted from that WTO primary focus to bilaterals because the Doha agreement was failing. The Doha included the General Agreement on Trade in Services. So Doha was intended to take it all forward on all the agreements, including the GATS. It was becoming blocked. And so they shifted to a program of bilaterals, and now we've got the biggie, the US-EU one. But the WTO is still there, and it's actually still the mechanism of choice because it's the global one. The discussions on the Trade in Services Agreement began in 2012, and the countries who are interested in doing it they call themselves the really good friends of services. Really, I didn't make that up. That's what they call themselves, right? So the TiSA has come out of discontent about the WTO. Within the context of the WTO and the General Agreement, where the General Agreement on Trade and Services is, developing countries had never wanted services in there, and they only gave way because and accepted it if they could use trade-off in services where developed countries have the advantage, if they could use it as a trade-off to get what they wanted, for instance, in agriculture. And that's how it got blocked, because it wasn't going in that way. So the TiSA, so Trade in Services Agreement, TiSA, right, is a sort of coalition of the willing. So it's a plurilateral agreement, which means several countries or a group of countries. The WTO is multilateral, that's all the countries in it, there are 160 countries, and then the other side you've got bilateral. So you've got this plurilateral, not actually in the WTO at this stage, kind of alongside, a sort of coalition of the willing. And it's like the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, but without the resistance element of the developing countries. It's currently 50 countries, including 28 of the EU. So counting them separately, so it's 50 countries overall. So currently it's kind of outside of the WTO, parallel to it, but the plan is to try to finish up with it in the WTO as a multilateral agreement. So all the way along, as it's going through negotiating rounds, which are very, very secret, you don't hear about these ones at all, it's always like GATS coherence. So at some point it can be blended with the existing WTO General Agreement on Trade in Services, but pushing it further. So the clue is in Citibank chair of the Coalition of Service Industries says that the free market principles can govern investment and delivery of services on a transnational scale. So that's the end. That's the end. The aim that it's all everything's privatized and handled by transnationals. So, as you've heard here, and with the TiSA, modern trade agreements are primarily now about restricting governments regulating within their own territory. Right, so restricting, say, the UK government's ability to regulate within the UK. So with a democracy in that, right? So it's really anti-democratic. So TiSA is a way to eliminate government's policy space to regulate, but it's not being debated publicly. It's very secret. So the position of governments in this, say the position of our government, will actually stay secret for 5 years after this agreement comes into force. And the UK government always takes quite a lead in things like this on behalf of transnational financial services, i.e. under the umbrella of the City of London. Yet we hear nothing about it. So the TiSA is being developed and negotiated away from the sort of public concerns that are the limiting pullback factor with trade agreements, like the growing awareness about TTIP acting as a counter, a pullback factor. But if you do it secretly enough, that pullback factor, that limiting factor is not there. So away from public concerns and with no accountability for politicians, especially with this 5-year thing, they'll be out through the revolving door by then, working for big corporations. So TiSA is about increasing privatisation and providing the grounds to attack the regulating of privately delivered services. So you privatise it and then you get rid of the regulations on the private companies that limit their profits. So you can see that governments like ours, on behalf of big business, want this agreement under conditions where you don't tell the public about it, and actually through measures that will be used against our government and will force deregulation, or the government will face challenges to it. So that's like that's our government going into that sort of situation for us. There's a few concepts that I think we need to get clear. Liberalisation means that when you're talking about services, liberalisation means that you open to transnational investment, right? Which is quite familiar in this country because everything's liberalised in this country. So when there are investment opportunities, it's open to transnational and foreign investors. And when that goes into a trade agreement, that becomes irreversible. And so that's one concept to get clear, that what liberalisation is. It's not that difficult to understand. So, and another concept to get clear is the difference between positive and negative listing of your service commitments. If it's positive listing, you name the services that you want to liberalise. If it's negative listing, you name the ones that you want to exclude. So negative listing is much more coercive because everything's in unless you remember to exclude it. So that's another concept, the positive and negative listing. And another concept is national treatment that comes when you commit services. You commit to treating foreign investors coming in, giving them conditions as good as domestic companies. So no sort of like government controls over foreign companies particularly. They then have the right, what you commit to is that they have at least as good conditions as domestic companies. The arguments given for service, for the service agreement, the argument they give to developing countries is that you have to do this sort of thing as a precondition for enhancing your domestic economic performance. So, like, you know, if you want to one day be like a developed country, you better get into this services agreement stuff. But the argument given to developed countries is like, you've got a competitive advantage in services, so it's going to be jobs for you. So quite contradictory, just to push it forward. TiSA applies inherent pressure to commit services for liberalisation, and they've got these particular things that create that pressure for an ongoing liberalisation. It's got a standstill clause whereby all service liberalisations so far have to be irreversible. So whether you've unilaterally, like you've just liberalised a service of the government's own accord, or if it's in an agreement somewhere, there's no reversing of it. Whatever you've liberalised at this stage, it's irreversible. That's the standstill clause. And a ratchet clause, which makes everything go forward with no possibility of going back. Which makes, say if you experimented with liberalising something, well, with this agreement, there's no going back, whatever the results. I've been thinking a lot in the last few days about the legalisation of drugs. Right, because a lot of young people would sort of think this is a really good thing, but it won't be going into some sort of like assessed social benefit. It will become a big business opportunity, right, on which there will be no going back. So all this about forcing inclusions in this thing. Also, a negative listing of the national treatment in TiSA. So everything that's been liberalised and no going back on it will has national treatment applied to it. So all of that means all the companies involved have treatment as good as domestic companies, which is quite a big thing. And the only things out of that is the ones that countries remember or opt to name as exceptions, because it is negative listing like that. So it's that very coercive negative listing.